Would you all give a great big Ramp the School of Enlightenment welcome to Travis Walton.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, there's so much to tell, and in order to be more concise, you know, I elected at the last minute to share with you this video. Over the last 38 years since the time this happened, there have been dozens of documentaries done, but this, out of all of those, stands up head and shoulders far above the rest. About the same time this one was being done, I was doing one with National Geographic that I expected to be, you know, the ultimate, because they were going to bring in scientists and do some follow-up testing on the radiation and the magnetic readings that were taken at the site. But all that turned out to be a very big disappointment and didn't live up to my expectations at all. At the same time, I was doing this video that we're about to see with the Sci-Fi Channel. And the interview technique was so unusual that I became kind of suspicious of what they were trying to do, that maybe that was being led into another ambush interview of some kind, but it turned out not to be that at all. The interview technique was really trying to get each of us to relive this experience, and that was somewhere that I really didn't really want to go in that kind of depth, you know. So these interviews were conducted separately in different cities. The people involved didn't actually get together. So this is just how profoundly this event affected a whole lot of people, to where the raw emotion comes through even after 38 years. So I'll get back up here and when we're done, and I want to, you know, get into some more details with you and answer any questions you might have. But let's go ahead and get the video going here, and the sooner we can get to the questions. Thank you. Thanks for having me here. This has been an amazing experience. One of a kind, and you know, I've been talking about this for 38 years, so it's really been very intriguing. November 5th, 1975, you know, just an ordinary work day, and I was, you know, totally unprepared for anything that was to follow. You know, this incident just totally derailed my life and changed everything. You know, people say, well, what would you be like today if this hadn't happened? And I can't imagine. You know, I just know it was nothing like it would have been. A lot of people are surprised, you know, find that there was that much forestry going on in Arizona. You know, this is where the real forest is. You know, so, this is one of the greenest places around. But we do have the largest ponderosa pine forest in the world, extending, you know, across from south of Flagstaff, clear into New Mexico. But we all lived in Snowflake at that time, and we had a 30-mile drive of paved road out to Heber, and then it was just all dirt road back up into the woods south of Heber, way up on top of the rim there. And the rim is kind of the edge of the Colorado Plateau there, and really, you know, some of the highest elevation anywhere around, except for the San Francisco peaks over there by Flagstaff. But you know, we had wild horses in the area at the time, and actually the herd is still there to this day. The mascot for the Heber High School is the Mustangs, but the crew here, Mike Rogers in the upper left, Ken Peterson in the middle there, and the Black Sheep, Alan Dallas in the upper right. Over there in the left is Dwayne Smith, and there's John Gillette in the middle. And in the lower right there is Steve Pierce. Steve Pierce was played, I don't know if anyone noticed, but he was played by Henry Thomas in the movie, who was actually the little boy in the movie E.T., all grown up. So that's always a little surprise a lot of people aren't really aware of. Me back then, the crew truck. If anybody knows where there's one of those trucks, get in touch with me. I'd like to get one because they're really rare these days. And you know, the look of that craft was just the most awesome thing. It was just so, you know, a lot of people kind of reacted when John was talking about how it looked like a brand new Corvette, you know, but it really was extremely impressive, you know, terrifying and just awesome at the same time, because the whole surface was smooth as glass. It was reflecting the trees in the area, the ground, everything. It's kind of like when you're looking at the television and the light is coming in from the window and you can see the light from the television at the same time you see things reflected off the surface. But parts of it were glowing and parts of it were just plain metallic. But the really strange thing was the sound it was making. It was a combination of tones that's just almost impossible to describe. I gave a talk to a bunch of engineering students at a technical college up in Rapid City, and they were very interested in the sound it was making. It was really off the range of human hearing on both the high and the low end. And apparently these students thought that, you know, if I could explain the nature of the sound, that they would get some clues that would sort of support the theories that they had about how these things are propelled or how they're driven. But one thing that didn't really come out in what you've seen so far is that when I got up to the craft and I was looking up at it, when it suddenly got louder, it startled me. You know, I was already very terrified and they were yelling at me to get away from there. But when it moved like that, I jumped forward and into a crouch. There was a log sticking up out of this pile of logging debris. And I got down behind that log and, you know, I had already decided I'd better get the heck out of there, that this was an extremely dangerous situation. So when I stood up to turn and run back, that's when it hit me. That's when this blast of energy hit me. And, you know, Hollywood changed some things in the movie, and that's normal. If you're familiar with any real life story that Hollywood turns into a movie, they always, you know, rearrange things to make it fit some idea they have. But I was surprised that this scene right here in the movie was played down to the extent that it was. It was much more violent, much more powerful than they represented there. It was such a blast of energy that all they saw was my body tumbling through the air with arms and legs sticking out of it. That's why Dwayne Smith said he thought I was disintegrated, you know, that there was pieces of me. And Ken said that the most frightening thing to him about the return trip that night was not that the aliens would still be lurking in the area, but that what my body was going to look like laying there. So it's kind of odd that Hollywood chose not to embellish that and other things that they tended to exaggerate. You know, hearing what actually happened here in this recounting that you just saw, you know, you're probably, you know, if you saw the movie, realizing that they really changed quite a bit, especially about what happened aboard the craft. Well, there was one scene in there that actually did a better job of communicating how I felt than if you'd have showed what actually happened. They show the actor held down on the table, and there's a membrane over his face, and he's struggling to scream, struggling to breathe through this. And there was no membrane, but if you had shown him just breathing hard and looking panicked, you would not understand the feeling of suffocation. The reason I'm dwelling on this is because, a lot of people think, well, I wouldn't have lost control to that extent. I'd have just kept a cool head and asked good questions, maybe grabbed a souvenir. But a whole lot of circumstances right there came together to evoke the greatest fear that I've ever experienced in my life. And I've experienced some pretty scary stuff. Bull riding, stuff like that is not, for the faint of heart. But the feeling of, first of all, I wake up. I'm in pain. The pain is already setting the stage. I'm struggling to breathe. I feel like I'm not getting enough air, And like Ramtha said about, the conditions on their planets are just not going to match up with ours. I think that perhaps what was going on there is that the atmosphere inside there was just not ideal for humans. But, I think that perhaps the injury of that beam hitting me in the chest may have contributed to the difficulty I was having breathing. But in any event, the fact that I was struggling to breathe, I was in all this pain, it's dimly lit, very humid, so claustrophobic. The only idea that, my most recent memory was the fear that I was feeling right before I was hit. That was still bouncing around in my head. And all these things came together, and then suddenly seeing them so close to me. I was lying there, didn't know where I was, didn't even remember anything at first, and then I remembered approaching the object, and but I figured that I'd somehow gotten hurt, that maybe running away, I'd fallen on whatever, that the crew had brought me to a hospital. So as dim as it was, the lighting, I knew I was on some kind of a raised operating table or gurney, and there was a light fixture above me, and as dim as it was, it hurt to look at it. So even though I was awake, I didn't keep my eyes open constantly at first. But I could hear the sounds of movement around me, and I just figured this was doctors, taking care of this pain that I was feeling. I had this thing laying across my chest, and at first, when I first tried to focus my eyes, everything was all blurry, and this is the gas station where the crew met with the sheriff that night. It's no longer operational, but this is to the point that somebody went on the internet claiming to know all about the story, and he claimed to be the sheriff's nephew, and that the crew had met with the sheriff at the Red Robin Diner. Well, this is not the Red Robin Diner, which didn't exist for 20 years after the incident. So, there's a lot of people who tried to capitalize on. There was actually more than one helicopter and airplanes involved in the search. There was also tracking dogs involved. And there was my blurry vision. You need a slide for that. Okay, just cross your eyes and imagine that. But when I finally could focus, when it was blurry, I thought maybe doctors with a surgical cap and mask, and this dark area was just their eyes. Then when I could focus, I saw these creatures just within inches of my face, and that sudden vision of them up close, something I'd never seen before in my life, combined with all these other factors. I have to keep coming back to the idea of the feeling of suffocation. The terrorists are waterboarded in order to get confessions out of them. They even waterboard our own special forces guys as part of their training. The idea being that they can build up their resistance to the technique, but it doesn't work too good because even the terrorists train in advance, because The feeling of suffocation operates on the fear centers at an instinctive level so basic that you're just not going to be able to reason that away. And so I was totally out of control with fear. And even though I felt really weak when I first saw him, or it, I raised my arm up to hit it away, but I could just barely move my arm. I was so weak. And it felt softer and lighter than I expected. But I immediately rolled away from it, and that thing they had on me fell off. And I staggered back, and I bumped up against, there was a shelf or a workbench behind me. And I just quickly looked to see what I'd run into. And I could see these instruments laid out there. I just grabbed the biggest thing I could find and started swinging it at them. Now, they were way too far away for me to hit, but I was basically just trying to threaten them into stopping. And I just was screaming hysterically. And they stopped out of range, and they stood there. And at that moment, that memory of them staring into me like that was the peak of the fear for me. And I, in recent years, figured out possibly the reason for that was that somehow their ability to control us has to do with this stare. Because they were all three staring into me, and it felt very intrusive, very invasive. The intensity was excruciating, gave me this squirmy feeling in my head that was unbearable. And so in my nightmares for months afterwards, it was that stare. Recently I was being interviewed for the new 701, the movie. And the school kids from Zimbabwe were doing their interview that day too, so they were in there. They had were no longer living in Africa. One of them was now living in Australia, another in Canada, and the other one in the UK. But I asked them about that stare. When the aliens got out of the craft and came towards the kids, and I don't know if you remember hearing about this in the news, there were 60 children in the middle of the day. The ship came down and came and communicated to the kids. And I asked them how that stare felt to them. And they didn't report any similarity to that excruciating feeling. They said it had the same emotional character of calmness and love and sharing, that the message that they were getting. So what I've come up with is that I think right then they were trying to regain control of me, and it wasn't working because of the energy that was in that beam. That when that hit me, that it disturbed the neural circuits in a way that made it to where they were unable to keep me on the table in the first place and unable to calm me back down. And so they turned and left. Now, what supports that theory is that after I was returned, Dr. Kandel prescribed an electroencephalogram. And this is a brainwave scan, and it was done at Barrows Neurological Institute, which is a world-famous brain trauma center there in Phoenix, Arizona. And because of the intense media scrutiny, I was put in there under an assumed name, and the technician knew nothing other than to search for signs of trauma. And this served, coincidentally, as a kind of a double-blind experiment. So when the technician discovered an unusual pattern in the brainwave scan there, that's, to me, evidence that supports the idea that this blast of energy that hit me was what was interfering with their ability to control me. So at that point, me making all these threatening moves, and I was actually planning on fighting my way past them because the door was on the other side of them. But they abruptly turned and left and went out. They went to the right, so I went to the left. And I went down this cramped little passageway, and you know, it was even tighter and more claustrophobic than the room I woke up in. And this feeling of total hysteria just drove me to run forward, but I was torn because I didn't know if I was running into something worse. At the same time, I couldn't see far enough ahead or behind to see if they were pursuing me. There's some ongoing research with this brainwave scan thing. I'm going to take the original charts, and we've got a volunteer, actually a couple of them, neuroscientists to review them, and I want to do at least one of them in the sense of a double blind, so that, you know, what do you make of this kind of a pattern? Is this consistent with an electrocution or a lightning strike or something like that? And then also I'm going to undergo a new EEG to see if that pattern is still there, which if it does keep them from controlling you might come in handy, you know. So there's a lot of follow-up research to go on. And one of the things that, this is to illustrate, this was pieced together later. At the time, I, you know, was just in a blind hysteria trying to escape. The idea that the doors on the walls of this round room in the center would open to the outside was not at all possible. You know, I would have just been still inside the ship. But at the time, that was my idea, that this was a method of escape. So I pieced together the layout based on everything after I'd calmed down and, you know, could think more clearly. There's a lot of discussion. I know we're going to get a lot of questions about these human-looking beings. But I was looking to get up to some other things that I wanted to talk about here. Not that either. When we went back to the site doing interviews and promotional work for the movie back in '92, Mike noticed that there was a change in the growth of the trees. And he took a core sample, and this is a tree that he took back in the winter of '92. I found out about this later. He did this research all on his own, but you can see that the tree at the time was 6 inches in diameter. It had a 3-inch radius, and the thickness of those growth rings is pretty consistent. And then abruptly, counting back 15 years from '92 when we took this sample, you can see that the growth rings abruptly came much thicker. And when I went back here a couple of years ago with National Geographic, I discovered a stump near the center of the clearing that had been cut the year prior to the incident. So here was a tree that was about 200 years old, 200 growth rings that had consistent growth rate like you see in the inner part of this sample here. And so that was very good to be able to find that close, a tree that was sort of a benchmark for the growing conditions on that ridge top for the previous 200 years. And none of the rings were as thick and dramatic as we had consistently every single year after that incident. And a tree is not a cylinder, it's actually a very tall, thin cone. And so using the formula for the volume of a cone, it was calculated that the trees nearest the center where the craft had come down were producing wood fiber at 36 times the rate that they had in the previous 85 years. So an 85-year-old tree doubled in diameter in 15 years. And because the outside circle would naturally have more area than the inside, that's how the math works out. So a lot of samples were taken and sent to labs, and there's some ongoing research with that, some follow-up research. Also, some follow-up research is being conducted. In 2 weeks, we'll be going out there and we're going to check for the radiation and the magnetic readings that were taken at the site. Some ufologists came out there during the search with some Gauss meters, and they gridded out the area and took readings, and there was extremely high magnetic readings with an actual polarity reversal in the direction the craft had departed. So the ongoing research with the trees and the soil there. Why would this happen? Do you think that this is possibly just a side effect of the present of the drive mechanisms in this craft, or was there some kind of an agricultural experiment going on there that they were engaged in, maybe the reason they were there in the first place? Or perhaps it was an anomaly that existed and they just came down to check out, why their sensors were telling them that this existed. But there is a lot of follow-up research, and some of it medical, some of it on the site, but a lot of coincidence. I'm told there's no such thing as coincidence, but I was looking at this topographical book of maps of the state, and it's divided state of Arizona up into 75 different areas, but the area where the incident happened just coincidentally was Area 51. And I could do a whole talk on the coincidences that have happened in connection with this incident. Robert Patrick, who played Mike, had already agreed to the role and then found out he was Mike's cousin. He was Mike's cousin on 2 sides. They were double cousins. And Robert Patrick's birthday was November 5th. And here it was 15 years after the incident. He was 15 years old when it happened. And just on and on with the coincidences in connection with this. Another coincidence was that my son came with me the first time out, and people were saying, "Oh, you brought D.B. Sweeney with you." And I go, "What?" And I didn't know what they were talking about. But my daughter took a picture. There's my son on the right. He's sitting right back here, and there's D.B. Sweeney on the left. Same light blue eyes, same everything, and there was all this was just coincidental, whatever you make of that. But there were a whole lot of coincidences with where the movie was being filmed, things that happened on. Like I said, I could just go on and on about that. There's some discussion of these kinds of things in the book, but they wanted to take a break before we begin the question and answer period. So I'm just going to kind of wrap up a little bit here before we go for a few minutes. But back when this happened, they portrayed in the movie that the whole town was against us, but it was actually worse than that. Half of them were against us. So you had people arguing with each other. The town marshal didn't believe it, but his brother, Glenn Flake, who was played by Blake as Blake in the movie, did believe it. And so there, between brothers, they didn't agree on it. However, each of these men's wives had the opposite opinion. So there you had brother against brother, husband against wife, and that kind of went through the whole community. But, it's as angry as I got about it back then, and as frustrating as it was, it's really understandable. Because at that time, they didn't know, astronomers did not know for certain of a single planet outside this solar system. They theorized that other stars had planets going around them, but it was only until Kepler when they could actually have the proof that, here last year, NASA said that it's a virtual certainty that almost every star has about a dozen planets going around it. So, things have changed, and the community is much more accepting. You know, I've had quite a number of people come up to me and shake my hand and say words of support, you know, saying, you know, I believed you all along, but I've been afraid to say so up till now. But so it's gotten a lot better, and science wins in the end. Eventually, the truth will come out, and so let's take a little break, and then I'll be willing to take your questions, any and all of them. Thank you.
Hi, Travis. My name is Cindy Johnson. I'm from Canada. And I've been here. We've had other speakers come, like Alex Collier, who's been abducted, but on a more friendly level by the Andromedans. And I got that, you know, you felt that the...
Can you talk just a little bit louder so they can pick you
Oh,
up
sure.
on the stream?
Sure. That you thought that the kids in Africa just were under mind control. I mean, is it your impression? I get that the people that abducted you were hostile.
Okay.
But is it your impression that all aliens are hostile?
I'm glad you brought this up, because I didn't really complete the thought there. At the time, I experienced this as very frightening, very negative, very, very threatening. But the reason I asked that question to the girls from Zimbabwe was to put my mind at ease about the reason I was feeling so excruciating when they were doing this, why that felt so threatening. I think that the combined force of the three of them trying to unite their efforts to control me, and that wasn't working, was what was causing that feeling. But it wasn't anything intentionally to try to, you know, harm me or anything like that. I think all they were trying to do was get me to calm down and not be a threat to them. So failing that, they had to leave. And at the time, I thought that the human-looking ones coming in was some kind of an intervention, that these small creatures had taken me and they'd broken some rule or something, and that perhaps they were, you know, it was an intervention, a rescue, that they were taking me away from them. But now I think that perhaps it was more along the lines of they had to take me aboard in order to revive me. That energy hitting me wasn't a weapon that was fired. It wasn't a deliberate act of any kind, that it was actually some kind of a side effect to the fact that when I stood up, I closed the gap between me and the craft, and some sort of a charge that had built up in it jumped through me to the ground. Now, that debunker that was on Larry King actually wrote a paper trying to debunk the idea of UFOs circling aircraft as being due to this incredible charge that builds up in the surface of an airplane when it travels at high speed through the air. And he, in this paper, said that this has been measured in terms of millions of volts. And that's just in an airplane. So if a UFO is traveling through the atmosphere at a very high rate of speed, it might build an even greater charge. And it might have been that by rising up like that at that moment, they were just trying to put some distance because I was dangerously close, and they were aware that this could harm me, but it was too late. This energy jumped and did the damage, which was probably at least cardiac arrest, maybe something worse. The other possibility is that this was a side effect of the powering up, that this thing in the hovering mode was of much lower sound, but when it powered up and started to move, it's got much more powerful. Like in the video you saw John say, it seemed like something was about to happen. And Mike describes that they felt that like there was a charge building up in the air. And, you know, maybe the hair raising up on the back of my neck had to do with this feeling similar to what people get right before lightning strikes, that there's this energy buildup. But I wanted to emphasize that at the time, I interpreted this thing as some kind of an abduction. I accepted the term abduction. But now I'm more inclined to say it would be more accurately described as an ambulance call.
Like an intervention for your well-being.
Yeah, you know, the nearest hospital was over an hour away, and none of the crew knew CPR. And I'm an ENT. I was certified in 1988. But if it's as simple as cardiac arrest, you've got 4 to 6 minutes to restart the heart or permanent brain damage happens. So, you know, I would have, if it was even as simple as cardiac arrest, they would have had to have me aboard within seconds in order to
Keep you alive.
Yeah, to keep me alive.
Okay.
So I don't think it was intentional. I don't think it was as nearly as negative as, and there's a whole lot of other evidence pointing in that direction. And I'll just go ahead and explain some of that. I wasn't dumped back in the woods in the place where they took me. And that's significant. The fact that I was taken to a place where I could get help. Now, why didn't they take me to my hometown in Snowflake? It was just 30 miles farther to the east. Well, Snowflake is in this big wide valley, and there's no place that they could have placed me down where I could get help that they wouldn't be visible to hundreds of people. Now, Heber is at the juncture of a number of canyons, a very steep wall, sort of a cliff situation all around the town. And the place where they came down, they would have been able to see if there were any vehicles coming for many miles down the highway. And then once they were below the level of the canyon wall, pretty much invisible, at the same time able to watch until I was able to make the phone call. So that's very suggestive that they were concerned about my welfare. You know, they could have dumped me off on some asteroid somewhere, you know, but they didn't want this to go down in the record as galactic roadkill.
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify that because I do believe that
Yeah, well, you know,
there's lots of
I'm
flavors.
glad it was the opportunity to explain that. It was an important point that I wanted to make there.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask some questions from our students joining us on the stream from around the world, several from your home state. Going to start out with Jason Brubaker in Bandon, Oregon. He asked, have you seen any UFOs since that fateful day of yours, November 5th, 1975?
Well, I get that question a lot, and I've said that, you know, if I was sort of dragged into this, I was reluctant. I tried to hide from the media in the days after it happened, and all that did was clear the field for the naysayers. So, you know, it didn't kill the story, it just caused the story to be more negative. So I found out that there was no running from it, even though when I was hiding from it, they were saying I had something to hide. And then when I come out and talk to them, then I'm a publicity seeker. So, you know, damned if I do and damned if I don't. But so I said, well, if anything more was to happen, I wouldn't say a word. But I will discuss one thing that happened. In February, there was a meeting of the MUFON group in Los Angeles. And Tracy Torme, the screenwriter on Fire in the Sky, was there. The new director of MUFON was there. And after the meeting, we were driving up I-5 to where it intersects with I-10, because I-10 takes us on home into Arizona. And we saw this craft coming towards us. It was, you know, these three lights, these giant black triangles. It was just... It was the most incredible thing to see this thing over a city the size of LA. It was gigantic. I can't believe the size of it, you know. It would have had to have been, you know, bigger than this building. Well, the only difference was the light in the center was not on. All that we saw was the corner ones, but they maintained precisely the distance. It was off in the distance, and then it came towards us, and then it seemed to sort of tip up a little bit right as it came over us, and then all three lights, maintaining exact distance from each other, turned. And to see something that massive move that quickly and that nimbly, to decelerate and turn that quickly was just, you know, it had to be gigantic. And it was so low that we could actually see the features of the corner lamps. And I was comparing that to the look of the burner on a gas stove, not in color, but just the way you have a circular row of points of light that are sort of brighter than the overall glow. It was a disk of light, sort of a orange, pale orange. And then there was an inner circle that was area that was brighter. And it sort of pulsed like it was like an orange flame or something, or some kind of energy source that vibrated in a kind of a way, but you could actually see the lights. It was so low. And then as it passed over, my youngest son, not this one, was driving, and my girlfriend was in the back, and she was able to look out, and she said she saw the black surface of the craft as it passed on overhead. And I was so astonished. I thought, a city of millions like Los Angeles, somebody would have had to seen this. But my oldest son went on and he found this website called UFOstalkers.com. And for that date and time, there was, it was actually kind of like Google Maps. There was all these reports right in that, a cluster right there by I-5 of about a dozen other sightings of people that had seen it at that same time. But as obscure as that UFOstalker.com, I never heard of it, but there was that many people that reported seeing that too. But that was certainly, the most amazing sight for my girlfriend and my son. But I really don't know what to make of that, other than it was amazing.
Hi, my name is Grace and I'm from South Korea.
제가 지금 궁금한 거는 아까 그 다큐멘터리에서 보니까 뭔가 주사를 맞았다고 들었는데
In the movie, it showed that you had an injection mark on your arm. So she's curious as to whether you had any physical effect that you felt after the event.
Okay. Yeah, that's another good question to clear up. The doctor that examined me described it as a 2-millimeter red spot in his report. I have a copy of it. And he said, and this is important, that it was not over any major blood vessel, which if it had been an injection, probably would have been over a blood vessel. And it was on the inside of my right arm, which if someone was going to inject themselves, you would think they would use, I'm right-handed. But it did fuel the speculation that this was all a drug hallucination, but I don't think people inject hallucinogens into their arm. But anyway, that didn't bother the people that favored that theory. Plus, I had blood and urine samples that were put through the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's drug screen, which proved there were no drugs of any kind in my body. Plus, several of my lie detector tests addressed that very question. At the time that the crew passed the lie detector tests, the president of the American Polygraph Association said that the odds were over 1,000,000 to 1 of there being an error when you have that many people passing tests on a single issue. Because, a polygraph is like 97% accurate, but when you combine that many tests, the odds add way up. Now, at this time, there's 16 past tests in connection with this incident. I've passed 5 of them from 3 different examiners with many years of law enforcement experience. So the point was made back then by Dr. James Harder, who performed the hypnosis, that had you had testimony from 6 people saying that they had witnessed a murder rather than a UFO abduction, that would have been an easy conviction. This person's going to be executed on the basis of the testimony of 6. But somehow when it involves UFOs, now we have to go, wow, gee, question all these other issues. And that's the 6 witnesses without lie detector tests. But thank you for your question. It was a good one.
감사했어?
아니 근데 약간 되게 젊어 보이시는데 다른 친구들보다 혹시 그런 것 정신적으로 혹시 느끼는 게 있는지 그런 것 때문에 이런 픽션을 느끼는 게 있는지.
Her original question was whether you physically felt any effect, and she is saying that you look actually very young,
Okay,
and therefore
all
whether
right.
that
All right.
could possibly
I-
have
I
any
always-
effect on.
I always
The
try
way
to
you look.
duck that question, but yeah. In the last 38 years, I never called in sick to work one time. So maybe it's just good habits and good heredity, but I don't have any dramatic medical anomalies to report because I just been so healthy, so, but what can I say? I didn't ever want to be the bug in the jar. I didn't ever tell anybody that until the last few years. But I did go in and get the printout from my employer because I've learned never say anything until you can prove it, in my position.
Thank you.
This is from Piladi Palacios. She's joining us from Venezuela this evening. What was the wisdom that you gained from this experience, and has this helped you to become a better human being?
Well, better than I was. I'm not trying to say I'm a better human being, but yeah, I think it really helped me in a lot of ways to be more understanding of people's, of differing cultures. I've traveled the world talking about this, and that's really helped. And in the last few years, I've tried to prepare people, for an acceptance of what's to come. That people keep envisioning how these other civilizations are. And I say, we've got to quit seeing these things as something supernatural or like invading monsters. And when I tell them, we got to think of them more like those people from way over there that we don't know too much about, it really doesn't go over all that well. I'm sorry, but that's just the way I think we need to look at it. So, I'm not going to quit saying it just because it's not popular. I spoke to a group of producers and actors and movie people in Hollywood here recently, and I urged them to tap into this huge treasure trove of possible stories in connection with alien societies that go beyond the invading monsters thing. So maybe a remake of Fire in the Sky would be a step in that direction.
Marina Della Bona from Italy asks, before this happened with the encounter with your beings, had you ever even considered that there was life on other planets?
Oh yeah, we work out there in the woods is very stimulating, and like we were talking about, we talked about everything under the sun out there, and UFOs actually had come up a month before or something like that because there was an article in the paper about some cattle mutilations in the area, and that was kind of touched on in the movie, that there was a newspaper article, but I think much more was made of that. Suddenly they jumped on this and tried to act like I was some kind of a UFO fanatic. They were claiming that the whole town was into UFOs. Far from it. It's about as far from a UFO town as you could get. But I never, bought any UFO books or went to any conferences or anything of that nature. But, just one of those things that everybody, they acted like if you'd ever heard of UFOs at all, that was discrediting you as a witness. That's the way they thought about it in 1975, So.
Well, on behalf of JZ Knight and my fellow students and our guests here this evening, I'd like to extend a big thank you to you and your son for coming up.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.